The war between Ukraine and Russia has drawn soldiers from various nations into the fighting on one side or the other. Brazilians were involved in the conflict wearing the uniforms of both armed forces. He said. The stories of the soldiers who fought for Ukraine were well known, but those of the Brazilians who were on the Russian side were less known. There was also on that other side courage and acts of heroism, but also fraud, fear, and lies. The war in Ukraine attracted the world's attention for reasons that were not limited to the geopolitical impact or the deaths of soldiers and civilians in yet another conflict in human history. Other reasons were added too, such as the sight of drones dropping grenades on soldiers fleeing in open fields or diving in for direct impacts against desperate men unable to shoot down these flying demons in time. Social media was filled with footage of artillery exploding over trenches, tearing apart exposed bodies. After the smoke cleared, they madly killed. Airplanes cut through the sky to drop ton-sized bombs on men who sheltered in mere wooden and earth bunkers. People watched this, often with their own bias, creating myths about the sides they preferred, which became part of the war propaganda. Men left Brazil in search of the fight alongside the Russians for various reasons, including financial and ideological motivations. Besides, there was the legend that fighting on the Russian side was much easier. Comments of all kinds were already talking about a war that Ukraine had already lost. Apparently, Russians weren't the only ones killed, and Russian territorial gains came without casualties, of course. Videos showing the forced recruitment of so many in Ukraine, although real, were treated as if it was the condition of 100% of the soldiers in the armed forces, desperate in complete defeat before an enemy that advanced with ease. News was frequent about Brazilian soldiers killed on the front lines, fighting on the side of Ukraine, but not about Brazilians dying on the Russian side. In fact, some experienced soldiers who survived the fighting and fought for Ukraine warned about the risks of death and the dangers. And they always advised going for motivation, but never for money. Given the nature of the conflict, ambition rarely survived for long. When the bombs started to fall and the drones began buzzing over the soldiers' heads, that was the case for Ivan Kruger, who commanded one of the companies in a risky part of the conflict. He himself said that he prepared when leaving Brazil, knowing all the risks he was taking by entering a war like that. And despite his success on the battlefield, he always made it clear the risk involved in the decisions to fight in Ukraine. On the Russian side, there was little news about Brazilians in combat. One of the first since the expansion of the conflict in 2022 was about a Brazilian captured by the Ukrainians while fighting for Moscow's forces in 2024. According to his family, he was deceived when signing a contract, as he thought he was going for a high-paying job. Shortly after being captured, he said he had a medical problem with his kidneys and that the Russians were not giving him any assistance. Only the embassy could get him out of there. He was captured the day after making that complaint. He reinforced this version while he was a prisoner in Ukraine, asked for diplomatic support, and only returned to Brazil after intervention. When he arrived in Brazil, the story changed. He stated that he traveled on his own to Moscow using the 90-day visa-free benefit for Brazilians in Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Initially in the infantry, he said he stood out in marksmanship and was assigned to a motorized infantry battalion, serving as a sniper. He stated that being Brazilian opened many doors for him. He even said in an interview that the war was close to ending and that Russia was already winning. He also didn't intend to return to the war, since he didn't see the conflict lasting much longer. These reports and testimonies gave the impression that the Russians were advancing without major difficulties. One example was the release of information about exchange of bodies of soldiers killed in combat. The Ukrainians reportedly handed over 19 bodies while the Russians supposedly handed over 8,000. From that, arguments arose that reached the absurd claim that casualties were 1 to 500 in favor of Russia, largely as a result of the proliferation of nonsense on the internet. It was enough to just look at the facts. Russia had indeed captured more territory, while Ukraine had barely advanced. Consequently, the bodies of soldiers, both Russian and Ukrainian, remained in the territories occupied by the Russians, or in what's called no man's land between the trenches. After all, there were no zombies in Ukraine, wandering back and forth. So the dead remained where they fell, especially in areas dominated by the Russian offensive. It was typical for the Russians to make several waves of advances in small groups, wearing down the Ukrainian defenses. The soldiers who fell in these attacks, therefore, had their bodies tragically exposed on the ground, where no one would rescue them. That was until the Russians managed to take control of the region, when they could then recover the bodies. But, as will be shown next, that didn't always happen. It was obvious the bodies of the soldiers remained where they fell. The bodies of Ukrainians killed in the captured trenches and the bodies of Russians killed during the attack were collected by the Russians themselves. It was one explanation for them, Uzis. However, the propaganda insisted on turning this exchange of bodies into proof that the Ukrainians were being massacred by an army that advanced with ease and almost no effort or casualties. This kind of propaganda influenced others, and the Brazilian fighting for the Russians had to face other problems, according to some sources. The Brazilians fighting for the Russians may have gone to the front because of a strong ideology, beliefs based on studies, or even just propaganda. They could also have gone for money or even been deceived, as happens in some sad accounts. But testimonies from survivors of the Ukraine war make it clear that only in the first case, with the presence of firm ideals, was there a higher probability of enduring the horror of war. The horror of war was present on both sides, massacring hearts, minds, and bodies. As much as so many comments love to proclaim that the Ukrainians were mere losers, forced to fight, there were just as many childish, whining comments upon learning that more than 10 Russians had died in 3 years of war. The truth was that the war killed and tormented spirits on both sides. And to move forward, it was necessary to kill and die. One big truth in the war was that the Brazilians fighting on the front for the Russian side needed to have as much courage as those fighting on the Ukrainian side. And that's what they did. They fought on the fronts, watching Ukrainian drones falling on them. Men like Vitor de Souza faced the worst, surviving day after day under the bombs, crossing the Ukrainian fields toward enemy trenches with a Kalashnikov in hand and courage in his heart. Vitor was still trapped in this hell when Fernando Masso, a Brazilian who arrived in Ukraine in February 2025, began to face hell both on the front lines and beyond. Motivated by online recruitment ads, Masso traveled with help from other Brazilians. At 44 years old, he had his Kalashnikov ready for combat. He went to Russia with his Masso, fully aware of what he would face. He knew war. Masso faced the Ukrainian fury, watching the fire consume the friends around him. But surviving enemy attacks during the months he spent on the front, he had to stay focused to survive so many dangerous assaults. Even though it seemed like an easy task, such as holding the defense of a trench, he was still at risk of quick death from a kamikaze drone, or else extensive injuries caused by shrapnel from Ukrainian bombs that exploded in the trenches. But Masso had something else to worry about while bombs were falling over his head. The bank account he opened in Russia started having successive withdrawals and transfers. It was being defrauded. As soon as he arrived, he signed some documents, not knowing what they were, trusting the men who helped him enlist. Initially, the pair of Brazilian recruiters said it was a standard psychological admission test, but the document was actually a power of attorney. Then, using that power of attorney, they took him to a bank branch. There, they opened an account for him, but the account was not in his name. It was an account linked to a main bank account belonging to someone else, and they could make transactions as if it were a dependent account. Frustrated and fearing retaliation, Maso maintained conciliatory contact with his recruiters. He tried in vain to break the contract, but he would be accused of desertion if he did so. During a break in St. Petersburg, he was even held against his will in a hotel, locked in his room and forbidden to leave. Determined to escape, he broke the fourth-floor window and fled down the fire escape. He spent nights on the street until he was able to terminate his contract, regularize his visa, and finally leave Russia. He returned to Brazil alive and outraged by the fraud, but without regretting his struggle. A soldier's motivation for the cause drives him to fight, but motivation doesn't feed the man or his family, much less in a job such a high risk. It was natural for Maso to feel deceived and give up the fight after what happened. Another Brazilian, who was allegedly a victim of the recruitment scam, accused the pair of recruiters of diverting the equivalent of more than 60,000 reais from his account. On the front line, he lost concentration in the fights when he realized what was happening, and any mistake could lead him to death. He had to get a lawyer in Russia to try to solve the problem. Meanwhile, in Brazil, a mother was fighting with the same duo because of her missing son. Anderson de Oliveira Ferreira went to Russia at the age of 25 for what was supposed to be a private security job. According to his family, he left behind a 5-year-old daughter, promising to return at the end of the contract. His mother never knew the real reason for his departure. When they finally talked, Anderson was already on the front lines. Ukrainian drones flew over the Brazilian signaling days of terror. Play TV. The exact location of Anderson's battles was never known, but it was certain that in that area, drone warfare was in full swing. The Russians had their own techniques for sending their kamikazes against the Ukrainians, breaking through enemy defenses with these precise attacks. Afterwards, the artillery unleashed hell on the trenches. Only then was the infantry sent into combat. Many of them were foreigners running toward death like Anderson. There were. Some claimed they had been deceived, like the Brazilian Angezdo Duastic and had not gone through more than 2 weeks of training to enter one of the deadliest wars of today. They were promised easy jobs, Russian citizenship and good pay, but ended up facing death fighting in the trenches. Nepalese, Syrians, Indians, and Sinhalese were killed or captured in the midst of this violence. The drones didn't choose ethnicities. When the attacks failed, soldiers were dropped in no man's land, often scared and wounded, trying to escape that buzzing sound that carried death as it crossed the skies, has descended upon those soldiers who came from such varied regions, killing and leaving many families not knowing what really happened to their loved ones. Or, perhaps even worse, relatives would watch the recording of their death in a war in another country. It wasn't just once that one of them was filmed running through the fields, trying to survive yet another wave of assault PE, while the Ukrainian kamikaze chased him. His face turned at the end, leaving his identity marked on camera, before the explosion ended his days of combat. The problem with recruitment in some countries became so big, to the point that Indian leaders directly intervened in a meeting with Putin.
Anderson didn't want anyone's interference.
In his last phone call to his mother, he said he would fulfill the contract until the end, bravely facing all the horrors of the battlefield. That was on June 29, 2025. He was on a mission once again after that. Now the Ukrainian drones found him. The bombs started falling from the sky. The Ukrainians had small drones dropping grenades on the enemies. In addition, they chased the Russians with large hexacopters, dropped heavier explosives, and carried more ammunition. These drones chased the Russians on the front lines, often finding a trench and dropping bombs on its occupants until everyone was eliminated. In the end, the bodies of the Russians were in the positions they had taken at great cost. This was one of the ways the Ukrainians slowed down the constant advance of the Russians who were taking over the territory. Russians continued to delay in 2024. Depending on the location on the battlefield. The only way for the Russians to get rid of these hexacopters was to use a kamikaze drone to take them down with a direct hit. In other cases, there was also the possibility of a sniper being on standby looking for these threats hovering in the air. The heavy gunfire took out the flying threat. Sometimes less powerful rifles were used, like the Kalashnikov 12, one of the most modern versions of the Kalashnikov, paired with a thermal sight. The drones, identified by their heat signatures even in the darkness of Ukrainian nights, were detected and hit by 5.45mm rounds. But not every Russian squad had this support, much less electronic interference to stop the drones. Anderson had to live with the attacks of the electronic demons that danced in the sky. When the bombs started being dropped on his squad, chaos must have set in. Whoever managed to survive simply ran away, leaving the dead and wounded behind. It was at the beginning of August that the mother received the news that her son was probably dead and that the officers didn't care to look for his body. There was even the accusation that this wasn't the case. This was intentional, because as long as he was missing, the compensation for his death would not be paid. The recruiters, however, defended themselves against the accusations. At the center of the recent allegations were two Brazilians, Antonio Nito and Arthur, who has lived in Russia for 11 years and claims to be a doctor, reportedly acted at times as a translator for the Russian army. Michel, in turn, gained notoriety by posting videos on social media since 2024 about enlisting in Russia, attracting young supporters of the pro-Russia cause. Both are accused of being involved in scams against the Nito. He described the accusations as absurd and the result of political persecution by pro-Ukraine groups, assuring that he will take legal action against the unfounded insinuations. Michel says that he only helped Brazilians interested in enlisting without charging any fees, and that all the volunteers' documentation was handled directly by the Russian army. He received threats from individuals linked to the International Legion of Ukraine, suggesting that the offensive against him is part of a disinformation campaign. Neither of them has been formally charged in Brazil, and since they reside in Russia, there is also no confirmation of local penalties. Although an investigation is underway at the request of one of the alleged victims. The Itamaraty stated that the Brazilian embassies in Kyiv and Moscow are available for consular assistance, but it emphasized that the government discourages citizens from participating in foreign conflicts. In July, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued an official warning about the risks of recruitment in war zones, aiming to curb the enlistment of Brazilians in conflict areas. But war has its attractions. Even those who aren't misled about the type of job often go because of the promise of high salaries or because of propaganda about easy victories. But the thing is, war gives these rewards to only a few, precisely so that these few serve as bait